Hitchcock's really an interesting area because it's set on the Missouri River Valley, kind of on the edge in the Less Hills, and the Less Hills run north-south for a couple hundred miles in this region. And a lot of birds, more than just raptors, a lot of like passerines and other species of bird and other families, I should say, use these bluffs to migrate north and south in migration. Um, so I had an awesome time just kind of getting to know the area out there. I do have to say Hitchcock is probably one of the cooler areas in the Midwest that I've been to. So um, currently for work, I am starting up guiding in Arizona. I guide for a company called Arizona Birding Tours. It's ran by a couple of my friends, Felipe Guerrero and Nolan Walker. And if you guys are ever in the region, just hit me up, and whether it's guiding or not, I'll show you around. So what is the purpose of a hawk watch? Up here on this photo, by the way, you can see this beautiful Hatchier Kreider's red-tailed hawk. Thanks for the picture, Jerry. There's like several hawk watches, over 50 spread throughout the country. And basically they all create like this huge pile of data, like just monitoring populations and counting like how many of each species of hawk is going through an area year after year. It's really consistent data. And between all these hawk watches, we can really get an idea of like where the hawks are moving through, how numbers are going, and then also figure out like the timing and situation. It really helps with the conservation of conserving these awesome birds. So from here, I'll start to go through kind of an analysis of all the species that we get at Hitchcock, which starts off with the turkey vulture. So right here on the bottom left, I created a line graph for these birds. You can kind of see goes through the numbers on the left side, and then on the bottom it goes through the years, and you can kind of see how the numbers change throughout from year to year. It's really interesting to see with some of these birds. In the case of the turkey vulture, it's pretty, there's not much change. It kind of varies from year to year, but there's no like big decline, or really the population's pretty steady. But Hitchcock's a pretty phenomenal area for turkey vultures when there's like strong north or strong south winds. They kind of just fly into the wind, and you can count like several hundred turkey vultures on some of these days. But the turkey vultures population overall is pretty steady. Here we got the osprey. Ospreys tend to feed on fish and lakes and rivers across the country. This is another one. It's kind of surprising. The species just kind of varies a lot from year to year, with this last fall being one of the lowest counts for the year. But that's another one. It kind of comes through early in the season, then around when the ice starts melting on the lakes and river, or when the ice is forming on the lakes and rivers, they start to head south. But this last year was pretty warm overall, so the numbers didn't really come through. I feel like there's still a lot of birds lingering around, which I had some birds still around the lakes pretty late into the season. Here we got the bald eagle. This one's pretty interesting because you see on the line graph that numbers were pretty high early on when the HawkWatch started, with some counts breaking 1,000 individuals in a single fall. But then the last few years, the numbers have been a lot lower, kind of averaging between like 600 to 400. And I think this mostly has to do with the warmer weather kind of lingering later into the winter. When I was up on the Hawk Tower, we were still getting like pretty good numbers late into the season towards like the last week. And that's another case of with like the warmer weather, the lakes stay open, the rivers stay open, they can continue to fish in these areas. But what you really need for like big pushes of bald eagles is these big cold fronts coming from the north, just like freezing all of the lakes and the rivers. And it's pretty cool because you can like watch eagles migrating down with geese, and sometimes like the eagles will be hunting the geese as they both migrate south with those big pushes of cold air. But bald eagles are basically like just becoming more widespread and abundant throughout much of the country. So it's kind of odd that the numbers have been dropping off. Here we are with golden eagle, which is a pretty interesting one on the line graph. Numbers have been declining pretty steadily. You can see with an odd drop around like 2006 over here. Not sure what happened with that drop, but it's otherwise a pretty consistent decline in the population, likely due to population and not due to like migration. Hitchcock is kind of on the one of the more western areas that gets golden eagles, even though they go through like Pennsylvania quite a bit and Duluth. But there's a good number of golden eagles that migrate south along the Missouri River Valley. Mississippi kite is a species that doesn't really breed in many places north of Iowa. There's some local birds that breed up near Sioux Falls, so we don't really expect to get large numbers of them during the HawkWatch. Another thing with them is that they migrate earlier, like start heading south into August, and the HawkWatch usually doesn't start till September. So you can see the numbers kind of vary around like 14 to 16 individuals down to like even like 1 or 2. This last year we had about 3 individuals go through, and I'd presume that those birds are just from that population breeding up around Sioux Falls. Here's the northern harrier. This is a nice bird that we were able to band, this hatchier male. I was kind of surprised by how like little body there is. Jerry told me before that they're just like wings and tail, but you can see where my hands are is basically where it's at its legs end, and then its tail is just really long. Northern harrier numbers have been like on a pretty steep decline over the last few years, you can see as well. That would be a phenomenal year to be up there and get almost 400 harriers going by. But this year we just had around a little, like pretty close to 100. But that's a pretty interesting species, especially just the way the bird is shaped so it can hunt. And seeing them up close is really quite shocking, because when you see them in the field, you often think like they're just a bit smaller than a red tail, at least to me. And then when you have them in the hand, those legs are like tiny, the feet are tiny, and they're just pretty small overall. But it's always a fun one to see out in the field. Sharp-shinned hawk was a pretty interesting one that we had this fall in terms of the numbers. We had this really big push around kind of mid-September to late September, as where the larger numbers usually don't start coming through till mid-October. And you can see numbers kind of spike up and down with a gradual decline over the last 8 or so years. But this year we had up to like 700 from the tower, which is pretty cool, with some days getting nearly 100 a day. So that was a pretty interesting one. It was fun to be up there on the tower and then to like just see like lines of sharp shins going over throughout, like after like kind of these right weather conditions with north winds coming around midday. Here's the Cooper's hawk. You can kind of see numbers tend to be around the same from year to year, or not the same, but overall, there's no specific like population decline. If anything, Cooper's hawks seem to be getting a bit more regular, except with the exception of the last few years. Not too much in specific with Cooper's hawks, other than they're pretty cool to see. Here's the northern goshawk. This one is pretty hard when you're up on the tower. Usually they zip by really low, just over the tree line. And I'm sure there's a lot of individuals that get missed in a given year. All of the goshawks I saw where I would spot them after they'd passed the tower and were already like on their way away from me. But numbers vary a lot on the line graph. And that's probably because goshawks are pretty eruptive, like from year to year. Numbers vary, but that line graph is just all over the place, with some years having quite a bit and some less. And last year was a pretty moderate year for goshawks. The red-shouldered hawk, it was pretty interesting. This last fall was the best fall for red-shouldered hawks in the count's history, just breaking it by one. The previous high count was 11, and this last fall we had 12. They're on the line graph, they kind of tend to vary a lot from year to year. I'm not sure why that would be exactly. I know a majority of the birds I had were juveniles coming through rather early in the season, and I wonder if juveniles might have been passed off for other species in past years. But it was, regardless, like I even had red-shouldered hawks like coming through fairly late in the season for them, so that was pretty neat. Here's broad-winged hawk. Broad-winged hawk's a pretty interesting bird. It usually migrates east of Hitchcock, kind of going down through eastern Iowa. They come down Duluth along Lake Superior, and then they kind of spread throughout there. And in order to get high numbers at Hitchcock, it takes really nice northeastern winds pushing them down towards the Missouri River Valley. And this last fall was not an ideal. I didn't get good weather conditions to get good pushes of broadwings. It's pretty slow with less, like around 340 birds going through, but some years reaching nearly 2,000, which would be really cool to see, but we just didn't get those ideal weather conditions to get those pushes. The Swainson's hawk's pretty similar to broad-winged hawk in terms of needing right weather conditions to push him through, except Swainson's hawk kind of meets its furthest east range at Hitchcock rather than furthest west range. This last fall, I know that a majority of the Swainson's hawks were migrating through like central Nebraska around Grand Island and Kearney. So it was a pretty bad fall for that species as well, even though we still had over 100, which is pretty cool to see, but some years getting up over like 3,500, which would be pretty phenomenal to see. Swainson's hawks group up in these large kettles in migration, and will just like feed on grasshoppers and stuff in fields, which is pretty cool. My house in Buckeye, I sometimes get huge, massive flocks of Swainsons stopping by, up to like 4,000 birds, which is pretty cool to see. It's the red-tailed hawk. That one's always an interesting species. Has multiple subspecies within it, ranging from birds breeding in the southern US to birds breeding all the way up into Alaska. So the time frame that these birds come through is pretty broad, starting up as early as the beginning of the season in September and having birds still migrating through into December and January. Over the last few years, there's been like, it's probably been the most noticeable drop or decline in numbers at the HawkWatch. And I think it's unsure of whether this is due to partially to like the species decline, but there's a pretty good theory that they're starting with the warmer weather. They're not coming down as far south as quick. So we're missing some of the red tails before these large north winds and weather fronts come through. But regardless, it's been pretty slow for red tails. We had a good year last year. It was like up to 1,700 going through, and that's like my favorite species of raptor, probably just because of how variable they are and subspecies and plumage. Here's the rough-legged hawk. That's another awesome raptor. When I came to the HawkWatch, I was a bit bummed looking at previous numbers. I didn't think it was going to be a very good spot for roughlegs to migrate through according to previous years, but I was pretty pleased. Had over like 40 individuals go by the tower. These birds just kind of migrate through south later in the season. They're pretty used to cold weather, so it takes good cold fronts to push them down early in the season, and they'll continue to migrate south into like January and even February. Down here in Arizona, we're still getting roughlegs popping in like every now and then. It's been a couple new birds found in the state just in the last couple of weeks, so it's pretty interesting how late into the season they'll be coming down. Here's the ferruginous hawk. Ferruginous hawk's not very regular as far east as Hitchcock, with birds not really ranging regularly till you get into the panhandle of Nebraska out in the western part of the state. They're mostly a western species, but there's some birds that migrate through Hitchcock, pretty dependent on weather conditions and fires out in the Rocky Mountain region and the interior west. But yeah, some years, usually 1 to 2. Last couple of years ago, they had a really phenomenal year with 4 individuals, with birds coming through as early as September, which is pretty odd. They usually tend to come through in October. But last year I only had 1 individual. I think it came through in like the end of September. The American kestrel is another one where you can see that's a pretty gradual decline. And I think that's broadly known, or fairly well known, is that kestrels are in trouble. Kestrel populations have been declining for quite a while now, and the data on the line graph is it's quite the bummer. But there's been a lot of projects lately related to conservation, setting up kestrel boxes, banning kestrels, monitoring where they migrate and such. So hopefully we'll be able to help out with that species. But yeah, you can just see this, the data from the single HawkWatch is pretty helpful. And then when you combine the data among like these 50 plus HawkWatches across the country, it's really useful stuff. Here's the Merlin. The Merlin's a smaller falcon, kind of similar, a little larger than the kestrel. Last year was a pretty good year for Merlins from the HawkWatch. It was an interesting push, similar to sharp-shinned hawks, with I think I had like 13 Merlins go through one day. And you can see we had well over like 60 Merlins this last fall. So that was pretty cool to see, with a lot of the previous years only averaging around 30 to 40. Here's the peregrine falcon. Peregrine falcons were fairly low this last year, actually one of the lowest years, and I'm not really sure why. I think their numbers have been getting better over the last few years. They were a species of concern not too long ago, but numbers have been going up quite a bit. This might have been due to like birds just migrating through later in the evening when there wasn't coverage on the tower some of these days. But yeah, their numbers seem to vary, if not getting better on average. The prairie falcon is another one similar to ferruginous hawk, but not quite as rare out this far east. Usually get around like 3 to 4 birds in past years, with some good years up to like 7 to 8 individuals, which is pretty cool. But this last year I only had one go by the tower. And I think that's another one that's fairly prone to weather conditions and fires out west, but it was pretty slow overall for prairie falcons in general. I'd like to give a thank you to the Hitchcock Nature Center and Pottawatomie County Conservation, who hired me to do the HawkWatch, and also to the Omaha Audubon Society for asking me to do this presentation and just giving out the data that we had this last year. And thanks for joining me. Is there any questions that anyone has?
Mary Clausen put a question in the chat box about the rising temperatures, climate change, as to if there was any talk of altering the dates of the HawkWatch. And I don't know, maybe Barry can answer that. I know there's been some discussion of altering dates, and we did alter.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did. We did alter the dates already. The starting time is September 1st, which has not been altered because of the Mississippi Kite's coming, but they've been altered at the end. We took a week off at the end because we just weren't seeing very many raptors going through, and we really don't know why. It just kind of, after October, it just kind of caved in, and that's the way the pattern's been now for the last 4 or 5 years. So we thought we could take a week off at the end, but to think that we should continue that, it's probably something we need to evaluate on, as it goes. But I don't think it would make much difference, quite frankly, to extend it longer.
Speaking as a hawk watcher, it did seem to be that last week that we dropped off for a while. When I first started, you would see a lot of cold weather birds, bald eagles and rough-legged hawks pushing through, and you'd actually see some more. The last few years, it hasn't seemed to matter. The bald eagles just, even in extremely cold weather, they don't seem to move. When you're up on the tower, you seem to get visits every day from the bald eagles that are up at DeSoto, just for a day trip down here to see what else is available to eat. But yeah, like Jerry said, it didn't seem to make a big difference numbers wise. Let's see, I've got one more question. Let's see here. Ann Wick, what is the last date? What was it this year? It was
13th.
13th, I thought. Yeah.
Yeah,
December 15th.
Oh, 15th. Okay.
Yeah. Kyle Finley. Let's see. Pull this up. How are the population numbers calculated? How do you know if you count the same bird more than once? So that's a good question. You didn't make that clear. I'll let you explain, Caleb, since you got there.
Yeah, so since these raptors are migrating like north to south, and they're fairly concentrated along the Loess Hills, mostly flying around the bluffs, but sometimes over the valley or the opposite bluffs too. In most cases, it's pretty obvious when birds are migrating south. They just go by at like moderate to high levels, depending on the species. Some of these ones fairly low. But yeah, they just fly south pretty directly, and it's easy to know then. There's some local red tails or like other species that'll be local that'll just kind of like work around the area, and you just kind of get to know the local individuals, because especially with the red tails, I think about all of them look different basically. So you just like take note of like the certain patterning, like how heavily marked they are or what the tail pattern's like. And you get to know like some of the local birds, but otherwise it's pretty obvious when they're just like kind of streaming south, you don't see them again.
And there's a question in the box from Matthew Rada. He kind of teed it up. I was going to say something if none of the other of us were. He asks, how do people volunteer for the Hawk Watch?
Yeah.
They come on down. Yeah, sure. We do function on, Caleb did, really Spartan work up there. When one of us isn't covering a day up there, I mean, he's up there, every day except for 1 or 2 days. So you're more than welcome. You're more than welcome, even if you don't volunteer. The tower's open. You can come up. We count usually from about 9 to 4, I guess, is our regular counting time. But yeah, if Jerry or Caleb, if you want to talk about the Hitchcock volunteer process,
Yeah.
because we do need volunteers for sure.
Right. Yeah, there's a really great crew at the Hitchcock Nature Center. And when they're open, if you're there, like that's when you're there, you could just talk to them about it, because I think it kind of depends, like getting you in communication with who the seasonal counter is, getting like their numbers so you can hit them up and see when you can come up to visit them or when they'll be up there. But yeah, I just recommend going over to the nature center, even giving them a call and talking to them about it, because they'll like line you up with when there's people out there and such. But in case I didn't specify, the Hawks watch season goes from like the beginning of September to mid-December. So anytime between that, there'll be people up there about like basically every day unless it's raining. So you could go up there and visit with the Hawk Watchers too.
Yeah, and if you don't have much experience, we'll train you.
Yes, indeed.
Hawk watching is different from birding, really, because you're staying in one place and you're letting them go by, and most of the time you're seeing them on the wing rather than perched, and so you're looking at different things other than you would be doing if you're birding, just perched. If you're perched on a limb, you have to learn things like, how does a red tail fly differently from a broadwing, and look at the length of the wing and different characteristics of the bird. So it is different, and to get good at it, you need training and a lot of experience. So we're more than willing to help you with that process.
And as somebody, I've been up for probably about 6 years now, and there initially you get some frustration because it is like Jerry says, it's not like your day-to-day bird watching. You have to you see things, sometimes you don't see them, but from very, very, very far away, and we have scopes and things like that. But there's a lot of experience that goes down, and you have to get to where you're looking at how a bird moves, that kind of thing. And the other thing, you have to see it well enough to know that it's going through, like Caleb mentioned. I mean, there are some birds that hang around that to count them, you need to see them go through north to south. But you can't get frustrated. I mean, take the time. It's a good group of people. Hitchcock really values their volunteers a lot, and the Hawk Watch volunteers are very valuable people. So if you have any inkling at all, come up for a couple of years and learn how to do it. And the folks that you're going to be around are going to be very helpful. So don't be intimidated by it.
And the more people on the tower, the better, because we got the whole sky to look at.
Yeah.
And if you're just learning or at the beginning, and all you can do is say, well, that looks like a hawk. Well, that's good, because that's probably one that's going to be missed by the counter or someone else. So every little bit helps.
And they come through at all angles. I mean, some of the accipiters and the falcons that Caleb talked about will come below your eye level sometimes and just pop up over a ridge. And once they get into the tree line, they're hard to to see. And if you've got an extra pair of eyes, is even if it's not a fully trained hardcore hawk watcher, they're very valuable because you can point things out that the other folks won't be seeing. So if you have any interest, please, do come up. And like I say, Hitchcock does a really good job of taking care of you as a volunteer. If I've got another question here. Let's see. You ever think of setting up automated cameras to count and identify birds?
So like the automated cameras usually take pictures when there's like movement within like 10 to 15 feet, I think on average, maybe a little more. So with raptors and most birds, it's not too great a tool, but with like water features, I know like my friends who have like really nice yards down in southern Arizona, if they have a water feature, they'll put like a motion camera next to it and you can find some like really cool stuff, but it's helpful for like surveying for species, but to get like an idea of the population density and such, it's not as helpful as like just going out and like surveying, doing either like migration monitoring stationary or doing like point counts, which is used more for like a broader amount of bird species.
If any of you are interested, Dana Cruz, who's on the call here, left an email. She works at up at Hitchcock, and she left an email for her to where you can send her an email and inquire, and it's in the chat box. So if you want to take a look, you can record that. Let's see. Could you say more about how you identify different species by the way they migrate? Oh, time of day, alone or in groups. That's a pretty good question.
Yeah. Like how to identify them based just like in general or based off of like time of day and such?
Yeah, I think the question was characteristics of how they migrate. Are they migrating in groups? Are they migrating high, low? I think that's kind of what we started to talk a little bit about, how the birds are, when you see them, you get to know how they're migrating.
Yeah.
You can talk about like falcons and being real point to point, a lot of times really, really quick. Whereas some of the bootios, the hawks, you see them spinning around up in the air, that kind of thing.
Yeah, the best way for me to like remember a lot of the stuff is just to like watch them for a pretty extended period of time. The closer they are, the more helpful it is like starting out to like not only be able to use the shape, but also the plumage and get a good look at everything. Plumage is just like the patterning on the feathers. So getting to know the plumage along with the shape and then getting to know both of those really well to where you can see it at a further distance, and whether it's just the shape that you see or it's just the plumage because the bird is like way out across the Missouri River Valley. It's just like seeing a good amount of them, like as I usually say, like putting in the reps at like seeing more and more so you get more comfortable. But like most of these raptors are like, they're all shaped differently in flight. Some of the more distinctive ones would be like turkey vulture and osprey. Some of the bootios can get pretty similar with like red tails and broad wings, but there's like slight differences shape wise. So just seeing a lot of them at variable ranges usually builds up your confidence and be able to identify them off of like fewer features.
Well, there's a third component too, and that's behavior. All of these raptors have different wing shapes and tail shapes. They fly differently. So that's the behavior. And for instance, the northern harrier, it can glide long distances, but it always gets in a couple of flaps in the wing. And other raptors don't necessarily do that. So that's something if you're, to look for. And Some raptors soar more than others. Others fly more in straight lines. Some beat their wings faster than others, which is an indication of size. And so there's a lot of some hold their wings straight out or up a little bit or down a little bit on the tips. So, you look at a number of characteristics when you're identifying these raptors, and they'll give you little clues, and then you can come up with your best case scenario. But sometimes you just throw your hands up and say, I don't know.
Yeah.
Everybody. That happens to everybody.
And Mary
Well, except Caleb, maybe.
Mary Clausen put a good post in. Mary's an excellent birder, and she says she's not a very good hawk watcher, but I think she's better than she's owning up to. She talked about some of the media. Get yourself a Hawks in Flight, anything by the late Jerry Liguri. There is a really, really good app for your smartphone called Raptor ID, and it was Jerry Liguri and a couple of other folks formulated. It's got pictures of all the different North American raptors. It has a lot of narrative. The really good thing, like Jerry was talking about, it has videos of the birds in flight, so you can see what's distinctive about one type of raptor over another. Because sometimes you're looking all the way to up to Blair, to see these things, and you only get a silhouette, and you don't, it's really a hard look. But that is a good ID, and it's a freebie.
Mm-hmm.
Or Jerry had ALS, and he died a few years ago, but he gave all of the media away for free to potential hawk watchers. So we can thank him for that. It's a good app. Looks like we emptied out the chat box. Anybody else have a question before we send Caleb back to the warmth of Arizona?
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question too. You can just ask on here at this point.
Well, yeah. Got 22 folks, but everybody's been well behaved. Well, if we've exhausted the questions.
Judy Dunn asked, when is the season that the count occurs?
Yeah,
I'm not sure that we answered that. It's in the fall.
Yeah.
I think that's what.
Yeah, I think that was one of the first ones. Yeah.
Oh, was it? Okay. All right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But yeah, if you have any interest at all, I know I sound like I'm begging, but you're a volunteer, so we accept you on your terms. And if you want to learn, the only way you can really do it is to get some of those field books and come up and ask questions. And there's always somebody up there to answer questions.
Yeah. I will second that. That Hitchcock's an awesome area. Like, even when I wasn't working, I was still like out there, like helping them with banding or just like hanging out with the volunteers and stuff. I'd highly recommend checking it out. They do like owl banding in the late fall and raptor banding. Then there's, like I said, there's people on the hawk watch every day. Even the people that work at the nature center, they all know like a good amount about the raptor movement, and they have all these workshops that they're always doing. So I highly recommend checking it out. And if I was out there, like I'd be going out there all the time, which is what I did when I was.
Yeah, the folks in charge out there are they would always come up and make sure we're not frozen on the.
Yeah, shout out to Dana and Jeff checking in on me on those cold, slow days.
Yeah, but no, I can't just reiterate what Caleb said. It's a really good volunteer gig if you have any interest. I got a question here. Let me see. Oh, good. Let's see. Where did I go here?
Caleb, do you want to talk about the bird on the screen?
Yes. Yeah, it's an awesome one.
Oh, yeah.
One of my favorite hawks that we banded at Hitchcock this last fall. This is a hatch year or juvenile, first year Harlan's red-tailed hawk dark morph. That might have been, I think that one was an intermediate, had a lot of white on the breast. But some of the traits that really help on telling this is a Harlan's would be these pale spots on the tip of the tail, on the inner web of the tail tip. That's a good Harlan's trait. And then on the underwing, you can see better, not as much on this one, is it has banding going out to the tips of the primaries up here. But overall, this bird's just like very dark. The front of it had quite a bit of white in the breast, but most of the hawks they capture at the HawkWatch are first year birds because they're a lot of them really hungry. They're not as experienced hunters. So most of my red tail pictures that we had from the station were juveniles, but man, they're from that bird right here on the screen to the first one, the light morph criders, they're so variable.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. And that you can reach a certain level, but you still have to go through all the subspecies, submorphs, excuse me, and use the correct terminology here. And they're very variable. We have some resident birds that live here every day, red tails that live here every day of the year, but we also get all the Canadian coming through. So there's a lot of variability.
Yeah.
Well, make sure I've got those.
Oh, there's a question from Dan Rada. How do you catch the raptors to ban them?
Oh.
I'll leave this one to Jerry because he's been doing it for a while.
Well, we use two different techniques to capture them. They're all lured down by starlings and pigeons. So that attracts them down to the ground. But we use a pigeon that's tethered. It's got a leather harness and it's tethered to a line which I control. And you pull the line and the bird goes flying up and that attracts their attention. But then there's a trap that lays on the ground that is netting, and it is in a circular shape, but it's hinged halfway, so it folds over into a semicircle and is latched down. And then we lure the bird down and we have it inside of that, and then we flip this, we trip the lever and it flops over the top of them. So that's one way to catch them. And the other way is the smaller birds are caught in mist nets. It's like a fishing net that's very fine and they can't see it. And so we have a starling that is in a triangle of nets in the inside of that triangle, and they're attracted to the movement of that starling in there, and they fly into the net, and then we remove them from the net.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jerry, you want to talk about the banding process? That always intrigued me.
Yeah, I can go into that a little bit. And then after we capture them, then we take them into this blind, which Caleb is standing in front of. And we put a band on the leg that is a individual number to that bird. Then all the information, if someone catches this bird or finds it dead or whatever the situation is, then that information is relayed to me by the bird banding lab that manages all the database for all the birds that are banded in the country. And so I get a notice that someone has found it another time, and then that I get further information about where it was found, what kind of condition it was in, and if it's in a different year, I'll see if it lived another 4 years or another 6 years. And you can get really valuable information on that. And then back to the banding process, we also look at the plumage on the tail and the wing primarily, because it can tell us the age of the bird and certain characteristics like subspecies that Caleb was talking about also. And then we take health measurements, to see how much fat they're carrying, and if there's any anomalies, like they're carrying some health problem, like a cyst in the mouth, or there's another thing that I actually saw this on the photo of a raptor, and I didn't recognize it at the time. But there is a disease that can take different forms of that the beak can get malformed, and it can be long, and apparently this is a virus or something that causes this. Or in this case, the red tail, the beak was broken. So we look for all kinds of things when we capture these birds.
Yeah, and what Jerry isn't explaining to you is usually he's up there by himself, and you get a great big fat red tail who's really mad about being captured. How exactly do you immobilize the bird to band it at that point? Because that was the thing. When I first time I went up to the banding station, I saw all these different sizes of cans, all the way from orange juice cans up to 3-pound coffee cans. So
yeah, we put 2 coffee cans or 2 cans together and slide them in there. There are of different sizes because the raptors are of different sizes. And we, over time, we've figured out just how much, what size can to put them in. If they're in the can that's too loose, then they can see what I'm doing and they'll shoot their feet out at me. If they can't, then I can pretty much control them without any problems, without getting footed. Raptors use their feet. They're not really biters, don't have to worry too much about biting, but you do have to worry a great deal about the feet because they can do some pretty serious damage, the larger ones. So yeah, and we measure the length of the wing, which gives us information. Sometimes you can separate the sexes, the female and males, by knowing the length of the wing, and just various measurements, and all that goes to the banding lab and goes into a large database, and that's how we learn more and more about these birds.
I think we've been through all the questions. I want to thank everybody for coming. I knew this would be an interesting time. Then we're planning several more here. We're going to have monthly meetings all the way up through May. We usually take the summer off and then start up again in the fall. And we will post the programs as they become scheduled. We've got some interesting ones in the books here. So join second Thursday of every month at 7 o'clock. And I was telling Caleb before we got started, this is one of the nice things about Zoom. We could not get Caleb if we weren't Zooming, because Caleb is down, as he has said, down in Arizona. So I do appreciate that. So I hope all of you have a good evening, and thank you very much for attending. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys.